The morning of the wedding, I stood in front of my mirror, adjusting the sleeves of my burgundy lace dress. I had chosen it weeks in advance, wanting to look respectable without drawing attention. It wasn't designer, but it flattered my figure and matched the color scheme printed on the invitation. My hair, streaked silver, was pulled into a low chignon, the same way I wore it at my husband's funeral. My name is Marlene Whitaker, and I've spent the last 20 years learning how to stay composed, no matter the circumstance. My son, Nathan, was marrying Clara today, a girl I had only met 4 times, but who made it clear she didn't think I was good enough. At the rehearsal dinner, she barely acknowledged my presence and spent more time whispering with her sister than speaking to her future in-laws. I kept my mouth shut, as I always do, preferring grace over confrontation. But even then, I felt something bubbling underneath, something I hadn't felt in years. Today, that feeling was stronger than ever. If you have a similar story about betrayal from the people you least expect, tell us in the comments and don't forget to subscribe. I arrived at the venue alone, as expected, since I've been a widow for nearly 7 years. The ceremony was taking place in an expensive vineyard estate just outside Napa, a place I couldn't have afforded in my wildest dreams. Clara's parents, Susan and Gregory Dawson, were old money, the type who wore tailored smiles and treated silence like a test of breeding. I felt out of place the moment I stepped out of my car and was offered valet service by a teenager who looked surprised I didn't drive a luxury car. Inside the hall, everything sparkled: gold-rimmed glasses, hanging chandeliers, roses draped across every beam. Nathan looked handsome in his tuxedo, but a part of me couldn't shake how stiff his posture was, how rehearsed his smile seemed. Clara swept in like royalty, her designer gown fitted to perfection, her makeup airbrushed into unnatural flawlessness. She glanced at me as she passed, her nose barely twitching, and then continued walking as if I were just another chair in the room. Still, I clapped when everyone else clapped and forced a smile through the ache in my chest. After all, this was Nathan's day. The ceremony ended with polite applause and expensive champagne flutes passed around like party favors. I found my table tucked near the kitchen door, far from the main stage where the newlyweds and their family sat. At first, I thought it might have been a mistake, a simple oversight by the event planner. But when I noticed Clara's aunts and cousins seated front and center, I realized it had been deliberate. My son hadn't even noticed, or maybe he had and didn't want to argue. I sat quietly, sipping water instead of wine, listening to distant laughter while pretending not to mind. People passed my table without stopping, their glances skimming over me like I was wallpaper. Clara never once approached me, and Nathan was swept up in a sea of photos, speeches, and posed embraces. I told myself this was normal, that mothers of the groom were often relegated to the background in weddings like these. But when dessert was served and I hadn't been given a plate, something in me cracked. Clara came over finally, radiant and smug, her father in tow. Her smile was fixed, lips taut like a mask she had glued on for the photos. "Daddy, this is Nathan's mom," she said with syrupy sweetness, gesturing toward me like I was part of the floral arrangement. "She's humble," she added, with a smirk so slight I almost missed it. Then louder, just loud enough for the table nearby to hear, she laughed and added, though I almost didn't recognize her without the buffet table in front of her, "I told Nathan she eats like a pig." Her father chuckled uncomfortably, his eyes flitting to my dress, my figure, my hands clutching the linen napkin so hard I thought I might tear it. Clara's words hit like a slap, echoing in my ears louder than the music. I didn't cry. I didn't flinch. I simply looked at her, really looked, for the first time since we met. And that was when everything changed. Gregory Dawson's gaze lingered on me longer than his daughter's insult warranted. His eyes narrowed slightly, not with mockery, but with recognition. "Have we met before?" he asked, stepping closer, his voice suddenly lower, cautious. "You look very familiar." I tilted my head, keeping my expression neutral, but inside, every alarm bell I'd buried for years began to ring. "I don't think so," I replied, though the words were a smokescreen. He was still staring, now visibly unsettled, and Clara noticed. "Dad," she said, confused. It's just Nathan's mom. But Gregory's face had changed. His jaw slackened. His fingers twitched at his side. Then came the question I had hoped never to hear in public. Are you the woman who bought Whitestone Industries? The music seemed to fade, as did the clinking glasses and murmuring guests. I watched Clara's face fall in slow motion, her pride draining like water through a sieve. "Excuse me," she whispered, turning toward her father. Gregory ignored her, eyes fixed on me now with a mixture of disbelief and awe. "For years ago," he continued, almost whispering, "I had to sell my company. I never met the buyer. All I knew was it was a private acquisition, handled through legal intermediaries." He stepped even closer, eyes scanning my face, his voice now hushed. "But the representative said the buyer's name was Whitaker. You're her, aren't you?" I stared at him, my silence confirmation enough. Clara was frozen, the blood draining from her perfectly contoured face. I offered the smallest smile, just a twitch of my lips. "Looks like your pig can buy the whole farm." I excused myself before the tension could boil into scandal, my heels clicking softly against the marble floor. I walked out into the vineyard, needing space, needing air, needing something that wasn't dripping in fake civility. The sun had started to set, casting long shadows between the rows of grapes, and for a moment, I felt entirely alone. The truth is, I had spent years hiding behind modesty, behind a curated life of simplicity. When my husband died, he left behind nothing but debt and regret, and I swore I would never again depend on someone else's decisions. I built myself up from scratch, attending financial workshops at night, investing in tech patents during the boom, and finally founding a quiet investment group under a holding name. I didn't need the world to know who I was. I only needed to know I would never be helpless again. But tonight, my son's wife had pulled the veil off everything, and her father had seen exactly what lay beneath. Inside the reception hall, I could hear murmurs starting, questions rising like steam over the wine glasses. People noticed when Gregory Dawson left his table and followed me outside. I kept walking, pretending not to hear his footsteps until I reached the trellis at the edge of the garden. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" he asked when he finally caught up. "You could have embarrassed us, bought your way into this wedding, stolen the spotlight if you wanted to." I turned, facing him with calm certainty. "Because I didn't want any of that," I said plainly. "Nathan thinks I live off a pension and small savings, and I wanted to keep it that way. He values hard work, and I didn't want to make him feel small." Gregory nodded slowly, processing, and then asked the question that made my spine go cold. "Do you know what Clara was planning to do after this wedding?" I didn't respond at first, choosing instead to watch the golden light settle across the vineyard hills. Gregory Dawson stood beside me with a tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there before. "She planned to ask Nathan to move to DC and work for a startup I've been advising," he finally said, his voice taut with something between concern and shame. "The position doesn't actually exist yet, but she figured she could make you feel guilty enough to fund it." My lips pressed together, not in surprise, but in confirmation of a suspicion I'd buried for weeks. Clara always spoke about opportunity with her eyes on the horizon and her hands in someone else's pocket. "She thought you'd offer to help once you saw how serious they were about building a life," he added, rubbing the back of his neck. "I didn't realize until tonight how calculated she's been with all of this." My silence lingered, but not out of uncertainty. "Gregory," I said calmly, "your daughter married my son because she thought I was poor enough to pity and rich enough to exploit." He let out a breath, slow and deliberate, like a man unburdening a terrible truth. "I'll be honest," he said, his voice lower now. "When she told me you were a librarian with a small pension, I assumed it was safe to let her lead." I raised an eyebrow, my gaze fixed on his, unwilling to let the judgment go unanswered. "I did work in a library," I replied, "but only because I wanted to be surrounded by silence after my husband's death." Gregory's brow creased, but he nodded slowly, sensing there was more to the story. "I bought Whitestone to save it from collapse after your mismanagement," I added without venom, only facts. "The acquisition kept your employees in jobs and your board from suing you for negligence." His face paled, just slightly, the weight of that reality settling in his chest. "Why not tell anyone?" he asked again, more gently this time. Because my son deserved a mother, not a mogul, I said, turning away from the vineyard and back toward the hall. We walked in silence until the music inside met our ears again like a thin veil of false cheer. Back in the hall, nothing had changed, but everything had shifted. Clara was seated at the head table, her expression vacant as whispers swirled around her like smoke. Nathan stood near the open bar, sipping a drink, his brow furrowed as he tried to piece together the glances and murmurs. Gregory placed a hand lightly on my arm and nodded, understanding that the next steps were mine to take. I didn't storm the head table or make a scene. That wasn't my style. Instead, I walked straight toward Nathan, my heels clicking like punctuation marks across the polished floor. "Mom," he said, surprised, setting his glass down as I approached. "Is everything okay?" I nodded, but the look in my eyes told him we were past casual questions. "Let's take a walk," I said, offering him no room to decline. Nathan followed me outside without protest, though his confusion deepened with every step. We walked toward the same trellis where Gregory and I had spoken, the sounds of the reception fading behind us. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice laced with genuine concern. I turned to face him, my expression soft but firm, and began the unraveling. "I need to tell you something that I've kept from you for a long time," I said. "It's not because I didn't trust you, but because I wanted you to build your life without expectations." Nathan blinked, caught between curiosity and unease. "I'm not who you think I am, not entirely," I continued, watching his eyes. "The life I've lived since your father died was only half the truth." His mouth opened slightly, but he said nothing, letting me finish. "I'm the majority shareholder in Whitestone Industries," I told him. There was a long pause as he stared at me stunned. "What?" he finally breathed, shaking his head like he hadn't heard correctly. "I thought you were. I mean, you always said money was tight after Dad." I nodded, acknowledging the deception, even if it had been one of protection. "Your father left us in debt, yes, but I rebuilt everything from the ground up," I explained. "I invested wisely, quietly, and never let anyone know because I didn't want it to define our lives." Nathan rubbed his forehead, overwhelmed. "Mom, are you saying we're rich?" he asked, his voice cracking with disbelief. "I'm saying I am," I corrected gently, "and that I wanted you to earn your path without any shortcuts." He took a step back, absorbing the weight of the truth like a tidal wave crashing into shore. "Why no?" "Because your wife called me a fat pig at your wedding," I said simply. His eyes widened in shock, his mouth dropping open. "She what?" he demanded, the tone in his voice suddenly hard and sharp. "In front of her parents, with a smile on her face," I added, my voice unwavering. "She said I ate like a pig, and then her father recognized me, not as your mother, but as the woman who owns the company he used to run." Nathan staggered slightly, as if the foundation beneath him had shifted. "You didn't tell me any of this before because you didn't want to ruin today," he said slowly. I nodded once. "But now the truth is leaking through the cracks, and it won't stay buried." He turned away from me briefly, running his hand through his hair. "I can't believe I married someone who would treat you like that." "She didn't marry you, Nathan," I said, stepping closer. "She married the version of you she thought would lead her to my bank account." He looked at me, eyes searching mine for any sign that I was exaggerating. But there was none. Only quiet, cold truth. "She told her father you were nothing more than a stepping stone to funding her next phase," I added. Gregory confirmed it. "She wanted to pressure me after the wedding to fund a startup position for you that doesn't even exist." Nathan's breath caught, pain rising in his face like steam from boiling water. "So all of this was a lie?" he asked, the words barely audible. "Not you," I said quickly. "But the way she sees you? That was never love, it was calculation." Nathan didn't speak for a long time, just stood beneath the trellis with his hands on his hips, breathing heavily. I watched him carefully, feeling both sorrow and vindication settle in my chest like two sides of the same coin. The vineyard lights flickered on behind us, casting a soft golden hue over the earth as the sun disappeared. "I thought she loved me," he finally said, his voice hollow, barely more than a whisper. "She said she admired how grounded I was, how I wasn't like the men she'd dated before." I nodded slowly, already anticipating the next thing he would say. "But all that time, She was just waiting for you to open the vault, he muttered, more to himself than to me. And when you didn't, she thought she could shame you into doing it. I reached out and touched his arm, just gently. I'm sorry, Nathan. I never wanted this for you. He turned to face me again, the disbelief in his eyes slowly giving way to hurt. How long have you been carrying this alone? He asked, the words heavy with something between admiration and confusion. Since your father died, I said. The debt he left was massive, but I had a background in accounting and a head full of stubborn ideas. Nathan exhaled, dragging his hand down his face. All those years I thought we were just scraping by, he murmured. We were, for a while, I admitted. But I learned fast and worked even faster. I reinvested, diversified, and made everything look ordinary on the outside. His brow furrowed as he stared out toward the vines again. So while Clara was judging your shoes and your dress, you were the one who saved her father's entire legacy. Not that she knew it, I said, a small smirk curling at the edge of my lips. She's always seen me as the inconvenience she had to tolerate in order to secure her future. Nathan shook his head in disbelief, a low whistle escaping his lips. And I married her, he said flatly. You didn't know, I replied gently. She wore the mask well. He didn't argue, but I could see the shame crawling up his spine like cold water. And her dad? He really recognized you. I nodded. He confirmed everything I said, watching his face carefully. He's the one who told me about the fake job offer she planned to pitch after the honeymoon. Nathan's hands clenched into fists at his sides. She used me, he said, this time with anger. I should confront her, he said suddenly, turning back toward the reception hall with purpose. I stepped in front of him and placed a steady hand on his chest. Not here, Nathan, I said. Don't let her humiliate you twice. He stopped, eyes flaring with rage before softening at my words. Then when? He asked, frustration simmering just beneath the surface. After tonight. Let her have her performance, I told him. The moment you stop pretending, she loses control of the script. He stared at me for a beat before nodding slowly. I don't know what hurts more, he said, that she lied, or that I believed her so easily. I squeezed his hand. Believing in love doesn't make you weak, I whispered. It makes you brave. We returned to the hall like nothing had happened, slipping back into our roles as wedding guests under the glittering chandeliers. Clara was nowhere to be seen, but I noticed her mother watching us from the far end of the room, her expression tight and calculating. Gregory had resumed his seat, looking like a man who had seen a ghost he couldn't explain away. Nathan kept a steady face, smiling politely when needed but never fully engaging again. I sat beside him at our designated table near the back, both of us pretending we hadn't just unearthed the foundation of his marriage. The music played on, the toasts were made, and dessert was finally served, yes, even to me this time. A waiter brought over a delicate creme brulee and placed it in front of me with a polite nod. Compliments of the bride, he said, almost apologetically. Nathan and I exchanged a glance, but neither of us reached for the spoon. We had lost our appetite for pretense. Clara returned just before the dancing began, looking flushed and overpolished, her smile brittle at the edges. She moved toward Nathan, her arms wide, but he stood up before she could touch him. You look beautiful, he said, his tone so neutral it could have come from a stranger. Clara blinked, clearly caught off guard, then leaned in to kiss his cheek, which he subtly dodged. Let's take a picture, she said quickly, gesturing toward the photographer. Nathan nodded once, mechanically, and posed beside her with a practiced smile. I stood where I was, observing every movement, every forced chuckle, every empty gaze. Behind Clara's eyes, I saw it, a flicker of something else, something sharp and unsettled. She knew something had shifted. She didn't know what, but she felt it. And now she was scrambling to pretend nothing had cracked. Later that night, as the guests began filtering out and the air filled with the scent of extinguished candles, I found myself alone again. Nathan had disappeared to speak with a few friends, and Clara was huddled with her cousins near the dance floor. I wandered outside to the back patio, where the breeze had picked up and the stars were finally starting to show. The silence was comforting, a soft blanket over the chaos of the last few hours. I leaned against the railing and closed my eyes for a moment, letting it all wash over me. Then I heard the soft click of heels and turned to see Clara approaching, her face carefully arranged into something between sweetness and suspicion. "Lovely night, isn't it?" she said, standing beside me as if we were equals. I looked at her, unflinching. "Depends on your definition of lovely," I said evenly. Her smile faltered, but she recovered quickly. "I think we should talk. If you're still listening to my story, please take a moment to subscribe. It only takes a few seconds for you, but it makes a big difference for me." I turned back toward the stars, letting Clara stand beside me in the quiet tension she had created. "Then talk," I said, my voice calm, flat, uninviting. She hesitated, probably waiting for me to say something warmer, something forgiving. When I didn't, she cleared her throat and tried again. "I know tonight may not have gone the way you expected," she said, as if the evening had merely been a mild inconvenience. "Nathan's been distant," she added, testing the waters. I didn't reply, and she took my silence as permission to continue. "I think there are some misunderstandings that need clearing up," she said, still wearing that well-practiced smile. "It's important for us to move forward as a family." I gave a soft laugh, dry and without amusement. Interesting choice of words, move forward, when you spent most of the night pretending I barely existed. She didn't like that, not one bit, but she kept her expression composed. "If I said something earlier that offended you," she started, and I cut in. "You didn't just say something, Clara. You called me a pig." Her mouth opened slightly, then closed again, unsure whether to deny it or play dumb. "I was joking," she said weakly, her voice losing confidence with every word. "You did it in front of your father," I continued, not letting her wriggle out. "And now that he knows who I am, the panic has begun to set in." Her shoulders stiffened, her jaw tightening. "I didn't know," she said quickly. "No, you didn't," I replied, looking her straight in the eye. "And it's killing you now that you do." For a moment, neither of us spoke, the only sound coming from the rustling vineyard leaves in the breeze. Then Clara shifted, her mask slipping just slightly, revealing a flash of the person underneath. "So what now?" she asked, a hint of sharpness cutting through her tone. "You're just going to ruin my marriage? Is that your plan?" I shook my head slowly, taking a moment before answering. "No, Clara," I said. "That part's up to Nathan. I'm not here to ruin anything. I'm here because you brought me here." Her mouth twisted in confusion. "You insulted me. You plotted to manipulate me. You tried to position yourself as the benevolent daughter-in-law who might help me financially if I played nice. Now you're realizing you bet on the wrong version of me." Clara's lip curled as she tried to regain footing in a conversation she couldn't control. "You think you're so clever," she snapped. "Pretending to be poor so you could watch us squirm, how twisted is that?" I turned to her fully, the moonlight catching the edges of my silver hair. "I didn't pretend to be poor, Clara. I just never told you the truth, because you never cared enough to ask." Her face hardened, but I could see the panic swimming in her eyes. "You've been playing a game this whole time," she accused. "No," I replied, voice even, "you just didn't know you were playing." She swallowed hard, understanding the implication. "What do you want from me?" she asked, voice suddenly quieter. "Nothing," I said, "because you've already shown me exactly who you are." Clara's breath caught as she registered the finality of my words. "So what, you're going to convince Nathan to leave me?" she asked, desperation creeping into her voice. "I don't have to convince him of anything," I said. "He's already asking the right questions, and now, thanks to your father, he has a few more." She glanced away, blinking fast, as if willing herself not to cry. "I didn't mean for things to go this way," she muttered. "Of course you didn't," I said. "You thought I was weak, easy to manipulate, grateful for scraps of kindness from your family." She turned back toward me, her voice sharper now. "You think you're better than me just because you have money?" I smiled, not unkindly. "No, Clara, I think I'm better than you because I never used people to get it." We stood in silence for a while longer, the distance between us growing heavier with every passing second. Eventually, she turned and walked back toward the reception hall, heels tapping out a retreat neither of us would forget. I stayed behind, not out of triumph, but to gather myself in the cool air. There was no joy in seeing her unravel, only relief that the truth had finally surfaced. When I returned inside, the hall had started to empty, guests hugging and saying their goodbyes with the bleary smiles of people who'd drunk too much champagne. Nathan stood near the coat check, jacket slung over his arm, waiting. I walked up to him, nodding once. "She talked to you," he said. "She did." "And?" I met his eyes and said simply, "She knows what time it is now." We didn't ride home together that night. He went with her, choosing duty over comfort, at least for now. I understood. The unraveling of a marriage didn't happen in a single night. I drove home alone, my car cutting through the dark with headlights that flickered over quiet roads and sleeping towns. At a red light, I glanced at my reflection in the rearview mirror and studied the face looking back. Strong, lined with years, but not hardened. I had worn grief like a coat for so long that I'd forgotten what power looked like when worn with quiet pride. At home, I made myself a cup of tea and sat on the couch without turning the lights on. In the dark, I played the conversation over again, not to savor it, but to understand how far things had come. This wasn't about revenge, it was about restoration. And as I sipped my tea, I realized something surprising. I wasn't afraid of what would come next. Not anymore. The next morning arrived with a silence so thick it felt intentional. I woke before the sun, my body trained from years of early shifts and later, quiet rituals. I brewed a pot of coffee and sat by the kitchen window, watching the pale light stretch across the street. No calls. No texts. Not even from Nathan. I didn't expect one. He needed time and space and perhaps a little distance to figure out which truths he could hold without breaking. I knew that feeling well. The weight of realization pressing into your ribs until breathing feels like a luxury. The mug in my hands was warm, grounding, a reminder that no matter how the night before had unfolded, I was still here. Whole. Prepared. Not angry, not anymore, just alert. By late afternoon, I got the message I'd been waiting for, short and direct. "Dinner tonight? Just you and me." I replied simply, "Of course," and didn't ask for details. I dressed in something soft, quiet, charcoal slacks, and a plum cardigan, the kind of outfit that didn't demand attention, but didn't fade either. Nathan chose a small Italian place he'd loved since college, somewhere familiar, unpretentious, and private enough for conversations that mattered. When I arrived, he was already seated, looking like he hadn't slept but had spent hours thinking. He smiled faintly when he saw me, the kind of smile that came from gratitude more than happiness. We didn't hug, not yet, but the connection between us sat gently on the table like a folded napkin waiting to be opened. "Thanks for coming," he said. "You're the one who invited me," I replied, offering him a softened smile. He gave a half chuckle, but it faded as quickly as it came. We ordered without ceremony, pasta, salad, mineral water, and let the silence linger through the bread basket. Finally, Nathan leaned back in his chair and looked at me. "I didn't know how much I didn't know," he said. I nodded slowly, letting him speak. "It's strange, learning your mother's a millionaire and your wife's a fraud in the same night." I didn't laugh. He wasn't joking. "It's not about the money," he added quickly, though that's still sinking in too. I reached for my water, giving him time. "It's about who you are," he said, softer now. "You've lived this whole other life while I thought you were just surviving." "I was surviving," I said. "I just did it better than anyone expected." He shook his head, not in disagreement but in wonder. "All those years I thought I was protecting you, paying your car repairs, sending holiday bonuses from work. And I appreciated it," I said honestly. "Even if I didn't need it, I appreciated that you thought I did." He looked down at his plate, pushing a tomato around with his fork. "I feel like an idiot." "You're not," I said. "You're just seeing things clearly for the first time." He was quiet again, chewing on more than just his dinner. "I should have noticed how Clara treated you," he said. "But I was so focused on making things work, I ignored every warning sign." "We all ignore things we don't want to admit," I told him. "Especially when we've already invested our hearts." Nathan dropped his fork and sighed. "She's not who I thought she was." "No," I agreed, "but she's exactly who she showed you she was, if you go back and really look." He nodded slowly, his jaw clenched. Dad always said I needed someone strong, someone grounded, he said. But Clara, she always made me feel like I had to chase her approval. That's not love, I said, more gently than before. That's performance. Nathan looked up, eyes shining but not crying. She wants to talk, he said. She asked me to give her a chance to explain everything. Will you? I asked. He hesitated, then said, I'll listen, but I'm not sure she realizes the foundation's already cracked. After dinner, we walked outside together, the evening air crisp with autumn promise. Leaves skittered across the pavement, whispering secrets only the wind could carry. Nathan paused near my car, hands shoved into his jacket pockets. I need to ask you something, he said. Anything, I replied. Why did you never tell me? I inhaled slowly, considering the weight of the answer. Because I didn't want you to feel small next to me, I said. I wanted you to build a life on your own terms, not waiting for inheritance or influence. He nodded, then asked, and if Clara hadn't said what she said, would you have kept the secret forever? Maybe, I admitted. But life has a way of shaking things loose when they need to come out. He hugged me then, unexpectedly, tightly, and I held him like I had when he was 10 and scraped his knee outside the school gate. It wasn't just a hug of comfort, it was one of understanding. A truce. An apology. A promise. We stood there until a car passed, and its headlights made us step apart. I don't know what happens next, he said. You don't have to, I replied. Just make sure that whatever it is, it's yours, not hers. He nodded and opened my car door, like his father used to. I got in, smiled up at him, and knew something had changed between us. Not broken, just rebuilt stronger than before. 2 days passed before I heard anything more, and when the phone finally rang, I didn't recognize the number. I let it go to voicemail, waited for the notification, then tapped it open with measured calm. Marlene, this is Susan Dawson, Clara's mother. I believe we need to speak. I'd prefer in person. Her voice was sharp, too polite to be genuine, like someone trained to make threats sound like invitations. I stared at the screen, letting the message end before setting the phone down. Susan hadn't spoken a word to me at the wedding aside from a disinterested, lovely ceremony, but now she wanted to sit down. I knew the type, practiced in social maneuvering, fluent in the language of reputation and legacy. If she was reaching out now, it meant the situation had shifted beyond Clara's control. It wasn't curiosity that brought her to me, it was fear disguised as diplomacy. Still, I agreed to meet, because silence wasn't armor anymore, it was ammunition. We met at a tea shop in the historic part of town, a place with delicate china and embroidered tablecloths, the kind of place women like Susan used to display power over lemon scones. She was already seated when I arrived, wearing a cream cashmere sweater set and pearls that looked older than her marriage. I took the chair across from her without small talk, laying my purse on my lap and waiting. Thank you for coming, she said with a tight smile. You sounded like you weren't giving me much choice, I replied. Her smile didn't move, but her fingers twitched slightly as she stirred her tea. I think we both understand what's at stake here, she said, still stirring long after the sugar had dissolved. I arched an eyebrow. Do we? Susan leaned forward, abandoning the pretense of sweetness like a woman dropping a costume after a party. You've made your point, she said flatly. You've humiliated my daughter, shaken Gregory, and now Nathan is questioning everything. I folded my hands calmly, letting her words hang in the air like smoke from a candle wick. Your daughter humiliated herself, I said. All I did was exist long enough for the mask to fall. Her lips pursed, but she didn't deny it. I'm not here to rehash Clara's mistakes, she said. I'm here to talk about the future and how we might move forward without this becoming uglier than it needs to be. I tilted my head, genuinely curious now. Go on. She's willing to apologize, Susan said. To you, to Nathan, publicly, if necessary. I nearly laughed, the absurdity too sharp to swallow without sound. An apology with a price tag attached, I assume? Her eyes didn't blink. In return, we'd ask that you refrain from discussing your financial ties to our family, or from making public moves that might affect our business relationships. I set my teacup down, the porcelain clinking lightly against the saucer. You think this is about public embarrassment, I said. But it's not. Susan's mouth tightened again, a tic she couldn't seem to control. Then what is it about? She asked, genuinely confused. It's about my son, I said. It's about someone calling me a pig at her own wedding and still expecting me to finance her fairy tale. Susan exhaled slowly, carefully. I'm not defending what Clara said, she offered. Then don't, I interrupted. She's an adult. She made her choices. But surely, Susan pressed, you can understand how one moment, one slip, shouldn't define a lifetime. I stared at her, watching the discomfort settle into the corners of her mouth. A slip is saying someone's name wrong, I said. Not mocking your mother-in-law's weight to her face while trying to leverage her for money. Her expression faltered just slightly, and I saw something like regret flicker behind her eyes. Clara was under pressure, she said. She thought marrying into your family meant stability, not surprise power dynamics. Your daughter married my son for access, I said coldly. She just didn't expect the access to come with consequences. Susan sat back, her hands tightening around the delicate handle of her cup. You're not what we expected, she admitted. You're not what Clara expected. Good, I said. Let that be the last miscalculation she ever makes. For a moment, neither of us spoke, locked in a quiet war of who would blink first. Then she asked the question I had been waiting for. What do you want? I leaned forward, matching her posture. I want you to stop pretending this is about reputation. It's about control. And you don't have it anymore. By the time we parted, no promises were made, but the silence between us was an agreement all its own. Susan wouldn't push further. Not now. She knew she'd underestimated me. Worse, she knew her daughter had too. As I stepped back into the cold afternoon air, I felt lighter, not because anything had been resolved, but because the illusion had been shattered. Back home, I found a small envelope on my doorstep, hand-delivered. Inside was a note from Nathan. I told her I need space. I'm coming over tomorrow night. Be ready for questions. I tucked the note into my drawer, next to my ledger and my late husband's watch. It was time, finally, to tell Nathan everything, not just about Clara, but about the legacy I'd built while the world assumed I had nothing. When Nathan arrived the next evening, he looked like a man who had walked through a storm and wasn't sure if it had passed or was just circling back. He carried a small notebook in his hand, the kind he used in college when he was trying to make sense of complicated things. I opened the door before he could knock, and he stepped in without a word, giving me a brief nod before settling onto the couch. I brought him tea without asking, setting the mug in front of him as I took my seat across from him. He stared at the steam rising from the cup before finally speaking. I don't even know where to start, he said. Then start with what you're thinking, I replied. He opened the notebook, flipping through a few pages filled with handwritten notes and circled names. I've been doing some research, he said. On Clara, on her family, and on, well, you. I didn't flinch, didn't react to the way he hesitated before saying you. He continued, I traced the shell company that bought Whitestone Industries. I figured there had to be some digital thread, even if the ownership was buried deep. I waited, hands folded in my lap, not helping, but not stopping him either. Took me hours, but I finally found it, he said, tapping the notebook. The parent company is registered to a trust out of Nevada. That trust is linked to an LLC with your initials and our old street address. He looked up at me, his voice softer now. You built an empire, Mom. Quietly. While the world thought you were clipping coupons and buying store-brand coffee. I gave him a small smile. Not an empire, I said gently. Just enough to never be powerless again. Nathan exhaled, running his hands through his hair. I don't know how you did it, he said. After everything Dad left behind, all the debt, the stress, the broken promises. I didn't have a choice, I said. Your father meant well, but he wasn't a builder, he was a dreamer. And dreamers without discipline leave messes. Nathan nodded slowly, clearly still wrapping his head around it all. So the library job, the thrift store clothes, it was all just a cover? No, I said firmly. It was part of my peace. After years of scrambling, I wanted stillness. I needed to know I could blend in whenever I chose. He leaned back, letting the words settle into the quiet hum of the house. Clara's father told me he always assumed the buyer was a group of venture capitalists, he said. He never imagined it was a single woman with a quiet grudge and a gift for numbers. I didn't buy his company out of spite, I clarified. I bought it because it was undervalued and I knew how to fix it. Nathan raised an eyebrow. But it didn't hurt that it kept his hands off the wheel? I gave a wry smile. Let's just say I preferred knowing the brakes worked. He chuckled, the first real laugh since the wedding, and for a second, I saw the boy who used to help me carry groceries home when we had to count every dollar. I think what stings the most, he said, is realizing Clara never asked you were because she assumed she already knew. Most people do, I replied. Assumptions are easier than curiosity. He looked down again, fidgeting with the spine of his notebook. She's asking for another conversation, he said. Wants to explain herself again. Start over. I tilted my head slightly. And what do you want? He paused, then said, I want to understand if any part of what we had was real. I nodded, respecting his need for that closure. Then listen, I said. But don't forget to bring your eyes with your ears. We talked for hours that night about Clara, about his father, about everything that had sat between us for too long. I showed him the portfolio, not all of it, but enough to give him a glimpse into what I had built. He was quiet as I clicked through the spreadsheets and holdings, pausing at the names of companies he recognized. You own part of all of these, he asked, incredulous. Sometimes more than part, I replied. Sometimes just enough to help guide the ship. He shook his head, visibly overwhelmed. You could have bought your way into any circle, he said. But I didn't want a circle, I said. I wanted a seat where I could see the whole table. When he left that night, he hugged me with a kind of reverence that made my throat tighten. It wasn't the hug of a grateful son, it was the embrace of a man who had met the mother he never fully knew. I stood in the doorway as he walked to his car, headlights casting long shadows down the drive. The neighborhood was quiet again, the same quiet that had once felt like invisibility, now feeling like protection. My phone buzzed as I locked the door behind me, a new message from Clara. I know you've told Nathan everything. I'd like to speak with you, woman to woman. I stared at the message for a long time before setting the phone down. Woman to woman. What an interesting phrase from someone who thought so little of the woman she married into. Tomorrow, I'd answer her. But tonight, I let the silence have its moment. If you're still listening to my story, please take a moment to subscribe. It only takes a few seconds for you, but it makes a big difference for me. I met Clara at the same botanical garden where I used to take Nathan every spring when he was a child. She chose the location, no doubt aiming for serenity, hoping nature's beauty might soften whatever she planned to say. I arrived early, as always, and chose a bench beneath a blooming dogwood tree, its pale petals falling around me like quiet snow. When she approached, her steps were slower than usual, her heels replaced by flats, her makeup less severe. Clara wore beige uncharacteristically plain, a visual attempt at humility. She sat without speaking at first, folding her hands in her lap, her eyes scanning the winding paths ahead. Thank you for coming, she finally said. I nodded once, offering no warmth, but no hostility either. You said woman to woman, I replied. I'm listening. She looked over at me, her green eyes duller now, missing the gleam of arrogance they once held. I didn't think I needed to understand you, Clara began. You weren't part of my plan. She didn't say it like an insult, but like a confession from someone who didn't realize she'd been holding her breath. I assumed Nathan's mother was irrelevant, someone I'd have to manage, not engage. I raised an eyebrow but stayed quiet. Everything about you felt small, she continued. Quiet house, ordinary car, off-brand handbags, no presence at major events. She twisted a ring around her finger nervously. I thought you'd be grateful just to be included. Instead, I said calmly, you thought I should earn your approval for existing. Clara winced. Yes, she admitted. That's exactly what I thought. For a long moment, the breeze spoke more than either of us did, ruffling the petals on the ground and tugging lightly at the hem of Clara's dress. I didn't plan to insult you at the wedding, she said next. It was stupid. Cruel. I was trying to impress my parents and thought belittling you would solidify my place above you. And now? I asked. Now I realize that I embarrassed myself in front of the only person who could have changed everything for me. That surprised me, and I tilted my head. Changed what? Clara took a deep breath. My future. I thought I was marrying into a quiet life, a stable one. What I didn't realize is that I was marrying into a legacy I never bothered to understand. You didn't want to understand it, I said. Because to understand it, you'd have to respect it. I see that now, she said. And I know I've burned more than a bridge. I set fire to the ground beneath it. I nodded slowly. So why are we here? I asked. Is this guilt? Strategy? Or just another calculated apology meant to reset the chessboard? She looked up at me sharply, but to her credit, she didn't deny it. At first, she admitted it was damage control. But now, I think it's clarity. I didn't respond, letting her sit in the space her words created. I won't ask you to forgive me, she added. I just wanted you to see that I'm not pretending anymore. I studied her face, searching for the lie, the twist, the mask. It wasn't there, or if it was, it had been buried deep beneath something more honest. Nathan's made his decision, I said. He told me he wants to separate. Her lips parted, but no words came out. Not because I told him to, I continued, but because when the veil lifted, he couldn't unsee the person behind it. Clara swallowed hard, blinking against the sting in her eyes. I still love him, she whispered. Then show it by letting him go cleanly, I said. No drama. No fights over furniture. No theatrics. She nodded slowly, her shoulders lowering as if surrendering a war no one else wanted to keep fighting. I was raised to believe power looked a certain way, she said after a while. But you've shown me that real power doesn't need to be loud. No, I said. It only needs to be certain. Clara stood then, brushing off her dress, looking smaller than I'd ever seen her. Thank you for listening, she said. Even if I didn't deserve it. I stood too, gathering my coat and purse. You didn't, I said plainly. But I listened anyway, because Nathan loved you. And I believe people should be allowed one chance to see their reflection clearly, even if they don't like what they find. She turned without another word and walked away, swallowed by the garden's winding paths, her footsteps quieter than they'd ever been. When I got home, Nathan's car was already in the driveway. He was waiting on the porch, legs stretched out in front of him, sipping a cup of coffee from one of my old mugs. You met with her, he said as I climbed the steps. I nodded. She say anything worth repeating? I sat beside him, wrapping my coat tighter around my shoulders. She's sorry, I said. And she knows it's over. Nathan exhaled, the sound somewhere between grief and relief. That's something, he said softly. Not everything, I replied. But something. We sat in silence, sipping our drinks, letting the weight of endings make space for something quieter, the beginnings we never saw coming. 3 weeks later, the separation papers were signed in silence at a law office with beige walls and no windows. Nathan didn't speak to Clara beyond what was necessary, and she didn't cry, not even once. The process was clean, civil, and eerily quiet, like the final breath of a house being emptied. Clara took only her personal belongings, declining alimony and waiving any rights to future claims. That told me she was listening during our talk, that she understood this wasn't a door she could wedge open later. Nathan returned home afterward, not to my house, but to his own, where the air was still heavy with a life he was no longer living. I visited 2 days later, bringing him soup and a stack of folded laundry he'd left at my place during the early days of the separation. We didn't speak much. We didn't need to. There was something healing about simply existing in the same room again without pretense. Sometimes rebuilding starts with presence, not words. Clara didn't reach out again, and neither did her parents. No legal letters, no desperate negotiations, not even a final farewell. It was as if they'd vanished behind the high hedges of their estate, too proud to look back. Nathan never asked about them, and I never offered updates. Instead, he filled his time with work, long runs through the park, and phone calls with old friends he'd forgotten during his marriage. I knew he was hurting, but I also saw something coming back to him, the ease, the curiosity, the quiet kindness. The version of Nathan that had been buried under Clara's ambition was slowly emerging again. One night, as we sat on his back porch, he turned to me and asked, Did you ever feel guilty for keeping your success from me? I considered that for a moment, the weight of years balanced on a single breath. Not guilty, I said. But there were nights I wondered if silence cost more than honesty ever would have. He nodded slowly, understanding the debt both of us had carried. That weekend, he invited me to dinner, a full meal, home-cooked, with candles and music playing softly in the background. It was the first time in years he'd cooked for someone other than Clara, and he moved through the kitchen with a focus I hadn't seen in him since he was young. I found my old recipe book, he said, holding up the stained, spiral-bound pages. The one you gave me in college. My heart warmed at the memory of that gift, handwritten in blue ink, filled with every meal I used to make when money was tight, but flavor was sacred. We sat down to rosemary chicken, roasted carrots, and rice pilaf, simple and rich and made with care. I forgot how good this feels, he said between bites. Not just the food, but the intention of it. I reached across the table and touched his hand. You didn't forget, Nathan. You just got distracted by someone else's version of a good life. Later that night, I returned home and poured myself a glass of wine, something red and dry that warmed me down to my fingertips. I walked through the quiet rooms of my house, touching photographs, straightening books, and thinking about the past few years. There had been loss, certainly, but also survival, not just mine, but Nathan's too. I thought of Thomas, my late husband, and how much of this journey had started with his absence. I no longer felt anger toward him, only a distant sort of melancholy, the kind reserved for someone who meant well but wasn't strong enough to follow through. The man who left us in financial chaos had also taught me the one lesson that saved us both: how to keep going when everything falls apart. I sat down at my desk and opened my investment files, scanning through the latest numbers, quietly proud of the empire I'd built behind a veil of normalcy. I didn't need anyone to know the figures, not the world, not even Nathan, but I wanted to see them tonight. Not because of what I'd earned, but because of what I'd protected. The next morning, I received a letter in the mail that made me pause. It was handwritten, addressed in looping cursive, with no return address. Inside was a single page and no signature, only the words, "Thank you for holding a mirror up to my face." I didn't like what I saw, but I needed to see it. I'm leaving the city. Please don't tell him. See, I folded the letter carefully and placed it in the drawer beside my bed, unsure whether I'd ever show it to Nathan. Maybe one day. But for now, I honored the request. Clara was gone, not just from his life, but from the one she had built on sand. And in her silence, I heard something rare: accountability without applause. Weeks passed, and the season shifted gently from fall to winter. Nathan started volunteering with a local mentorship program, helping college students navigate their first jobs and interviews. He didn't talk much about why he joined, but I knew. He wanted to be the guide he never had, to offer others the foundation Clara had pretended to want but never cared to build. I visited the center once, quietly, watching from the hallway as he coached a nervous young man through a mock interview. His voice was steady, kind, confident, not just as a mentor, but as a man who had reclaimed himself. I walked away before he saw me, smiling to myself. Some restorations don't need recognition. They just need space and time and truth. One night, Nathan stopped by unannounced with takeout and a movie he remembered I loved. We curled up on the couch like we used to, watching old black and white comedies and laughing until our sides ached. When the credits rolled, he turned to me and said, "You've been the strongest person I've ever known." I shook my head, smiling. "No, sweetheart. I've just been the quietest person in the room, and sometimes that's where the real strength hides." He rested his head on my shoulder like he hadn't done since he was a boy. And in that moment, I didn't feel like the woman who'd been insulted at her son's wedding. I felt like the mother who had finally come home to her son. And this time, nothing would ever take that away. 3 months later, Nathan called with a different tone in his voice, lighter, steadier, like someone waking from a long winter nap. "I've met someone," he said, and I could hear the caution laced behind his optimism. He didn't rush the details, didn't list her credentials or her family history like he once had with Clara. Instead, he spoke about small things, how she made him laugh, how she didn't flinch when he talked about failure, how she loved silence and homemade soup. Her name was Lila, and she taught literature at a community college in the city. I asked him if she knew anything about me, and he chuckled softly. "She knows you raised me right and that you like puzzles," he said. "That's all for now." I nodded, feeling no need to explain or correct. Let her meet me as I am, not as a resume, not as a legend. Just a woman who had once been called a pig and decided to be a lion instead. The first time I met Lila was on a rainy Sunday afternoon at Nathan's apartment, the kind of day perfect for coffee and card games. She wore a wool sweater and jeans, no makeup, her dark curls tied back with a pencil. She smiled when she saw me and hugged me like we'd already shared something important. "I brought banana bread," she said, lifting a foil-covered loaf like it was a peace offering. Nathan was nervous, though he tried to hide it, bouncing from chair to chair as if expecting the walls to cave in. I didn't say much at first, just watched her move, the ease with which she set the table, the way she noticed when I preferred honey over sugar in my tea. She asked about books, about travel, about the weird plants Nathan kept forgetting to water. Never once did she bring up money, my son's past marriage, or what kind of car I drove. When she finally excused herself to take a phone call, Nathan turned to me and asked, "Well," I looked at him and said, "You finally chose someone who sees you, not your future." That winter melted into spring without drama, without scandal, and for the first time in years, peace didn't feel borrowed. I downsized my holdings, moved a portion of my investments into sustainable ventures, and started a small scholarship fund in Thomas's name. It wasn't flashy, and it wasn't meant to be, just an anonymous hand extended to someone who needed one. The library where I once worked invited me back to speak on budgeting and financial independence, still unaware of the extent of my fortune. I accepted, standing before a crowd of women who reminded me of who I'd once been, tired, hopeful, and underestimated. I told them about the days I clipped coupons and paid bills in pennies, and the nights I stayed up learning about market trends while folding laundry. I didn't speak about net worth or board meetings or shell companies. I spoke about survival, strategy, and why dignity matters more than decoration. When I finished, one woman came up and said, "You talk like someone who's been through hell and turned it into a map." I smiled, thinking of Clara's face the night she tried to humiliate me. "Maybe I have," I said. "But now I teach the directions." Nathan proposed to Lila in the spring beneath the same dogwood tree where I'd last met Clara. He didn't know that the location was coincidence, but when he told me, I smiled quietly at the poetry of it. This time, the engagement was slow, deliberate, and entirely theirs. No grand parties, no flashy announcements, just two people choosing to build something steady. Lila invited me to lunch 2 weeks later and asked me if I'd help her plan a small garden wedding. "We want something with soul," she said. "Something real." I said yes, and for the first time in a long time, I was excited to help, not because I had something to prove, but because I was being included without conditions. There were no seating charts based on power, no strategic invitations. Just love, blooming gently like the roses Lila hoped would line the aisle. The wedding took place that summer, held in a friend's backyard, filled with hydrangeas and wild rosemary. I wore a soft green dress and carried a simple clutch, no pearls, no statement shoes, just comfort. Nathan looked relaxed, almost boyish again, and when he saw me across the lawn, he beamed. "Mom," he said, hugging me tightly, "this is what it was always supposed to feel like." I nodded, holding back tears, not from sadness, but from a fullness I hadn't known I was missing. Lila walked down the makeshift aisle barefoot, smiling like the world had finally tilted in her favor. There was no orchestra, no rented doves, just a single guitarist playing Leonard Cohen. The ceremony was short, sweet, and soaked in sincerity. When they exchanged vows, Lila said, "I don't want your name or your past. I want your presence." And in that moment, I knew my son had finally found home. After the wedding, guests mingled with plates of finger foods and cups of lemonade. I sat beneath the shade of an old oak, watching Nathan talk to old coworkers, now friends again. Lila joined me, her white dress smudged with grass and joy. I hope this isn't too quiet for you, she said, nudging my shoulder. I shook my head. Quiet is where the truth lives, I said. She leaned back in her chair and said, I think you're the strongest person I've ever met. I chuckled softly. That makes two of us, I said. We clinked plastic cups together and toasted to simplicity. In the months that followed, life returned to a rhythm I hadn't realized I missed. I hosted dinner once a month, just the three of us, trading stories over soup and cornbread. Sometimes we talked about investments. Nathan had grown curious now, and other times we just played cards until it was too late to drive. The scholarship fund helped 3 students that first year, all of them women returning to school after losing everything. I never met them, but I read their essays, their dreams folded into paragraphs like prayers. On quiet evenings, I still walked my neighborhood, unnoticed, unremarkable, and completely at peace. I no longer needed anyone to underestimate me. But I didn't need their praise either. I had my name, my work, my son, and that was wealth no one could measure. The story people whisper about me has faded, replaced by newer scandals, louder characters, flashier dramas. I prefer it that way. Let them forget the woman in the navy dress who once stood at the edge of a wedding reception and rewrote everything with a single glance. Let them forget the insult, the gasp, the realization. I didn't build my life for applause, I built it for endurance. So when I'm gone, I don't want a plaque or a portrait. Just a legacy that whispers, she knew her worth, even when others didn't. And she never once let it be defined by anyone else's imagination. Thank you for listening to my story. Before you leave, there's another story similar to the one you just watched. You'll see it on the top left of your screen.